one of my previous videos, I talked about just a little bit about God's pattern for judgment, how he does this. There's a process that God goes through when he's about to judge a city or a country or the world or a person. And this pattern, pretty much, you can follow it throughout Scripture from Genesis to Revelation. In the video where we kind of looked at this judgment pattern, I was looking at Jesus as the resplendent angel of the Lord in Revelation 18, who shows up at the destruction of Mystery Babylon, the harlot. Now, Mystery Babylon's judgment was actually threefold. Okay, so the first time God came down to see what was happening at the Tower of Babel, and this is in Genesis chapter 11. He came down, he looked at what was going on. He said, this is really bad. If they continue this way, nothing will be impossible for them. So rather than judging them as in like killing everybody, he still wanted people to populate the earth and to spread out. So he confused the languages. And in other words, he postponed the judgment of Babel. So that judgment was postponed, and the people spread all over the world. And they took the ideas and this rebellion that had been sown inside of their hearts, the seeds of this rebellion against God, and they brought it everywhere they went. So Mystery Babylon is actually the continuation of the Tower of Babel that we read about in Genesis. So Babel has spread over the whole earth. Okay, that's why we know that the harlot sits on many waters, that the judgment of the harlot that we read about at the sixth trumpet, second woe in Revelation chapters 9 and 11, that judgment will take place. God will put it in the hearts of the beast and the 10 kings on a specific hour, day, month, and year. A third of mankind will be killed by fire, smoke, and sulfur. This is the destruction of Mystery Babylon. But Revelation 9 tells us that not everyone is going to be destroyed who's a part of that, and not everyone is going to give up the whole Babylonian system. And so there will be a final destruction of the harlot of Babylon at the seventh bowl. Okay, so the judgment of Babel was postponed until the time of the end, and then it will be a great big judgment and a finishing off of Babylon at the very end of the 7 years. The pattern is this, that God sees what's going on, he comes down, he checks it out, and then he either rescues the righteous, if there's any righteous people living there, as in Sodom, there was Lot who was delivered. Sometimes he goes ahead and makes a complete and total destruction right at that time, like he did with the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And sometimes he postpones the fateful day of judgment. So this is how that pattern goes. First, there is a violation of something that God has commanded. And this could be a one-time prohibition, like don't eat from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Or it could be, like he told the people after the flood, you need to spread out over the whole earth. And instead of doing that, they were congregating in cities. It could be a violation that's, just this one-time thing, or it's an ongoing violation, something that's been going on for a long time. Like during the time just prior to the flood, there was violence that was accelerating on the earth, and partially due to this incursion of fallen angels. So sometimes the violation of a command, or there was this perpetual problem that was going on. In any case, God's command has been violated. The second thing that happens is that God actually comes down to check it out. Okay, God shows up on the scene, and this is very interesting. In the example that we're going to look at more deeply today, in the fall of man in the Garden of Eden, which is a very interesting story, God shows up to go for what we think of as a walk that has been happening on a regular basis, where God walks with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day in the garden. Anyway, God shows up at the time of the Tower of Babel. God came down to see what was going on. At the time of the flood, God is looking at what's happening, and he basically tells Noah what the deal is, and that Noah is to use the plans that God's going to provide and build an ark that will spare him from the judgment that's coming. In Genesis 6, starting with verse 11, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I've determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood." And then he gives the directions for how to build the ark, and that he's going to establish his covenant with Noah. So presumably God shows up on the earth to tell Noah what he's about to do. He's got a plan to rescue him. God shows up on the scene, and then he has a plan to rescue the righteous. Okay. So if there are any righteous people, he will get them out of the situation before he begins his judgment. So in the case of Sodom, of course, Lot and his daughters were rescued. And in the case of the flood, Noah and his family were rescued. He rescues the righteous before he actually makes good on the judgment. And then after he's rescued the righteous, then the judgment is meted out. Okay, sometimes, as in the case of Babylon, Mystery Babylon the harlot, the judgment is going to be in parts. It's not a total judgment. It's pretty thorough, but it's going to be completed at a later date. And sometimes the judgment is very thorough, as in the time of Sodom, and also when God sent the flood on the earth. Okay, those were two big catastrophes where the whole earth was judged. The wrath of God came on all the cities there that participated in this strange flesh kind of thing they were doing, and the world, who was corrupt through the violence of the, what I believe, the watchers, the intermingling of fallen angels with people, and then filling the world with violence and corrupting all flesh on the earth. Okay, then God took care of all that. An interesting thing that I've observed along the way is that whenever you see a big judgment of God, a big destruction, somehow or another, fallen angels or Satan have had their fingers in the pie, and they've messed with God's highest creation, which is man. And they're messing with the image of God in man. That's one of the big no-nos. It's a big violation. People are supposed to reproduce after their kind. Everything God has made is to reproduce after its kind, and fallen angels are not to reproduce at all. Okay, they are not to do that. They are just to keep their estate that they've been assigned. And of course, there were some that chose not to do that. So sometimes when God shows up, he rescues the righteous, like he did with Lot and with Noah. And sometimes what he does is he postpones the judgment, like he did with the Tower of Babel. And sometimes he does something totally out of the blue, okay, that you would never expect him to do. And this was the deal with the fall in the Garden of Eden. When God placed the man in the garden, he gave man and the woman dominion over the earth, over all the creatures of the earth and over the earth. The people were to be king, okay? They were given this dominion. This dominion was under God, and it was a stewardship that they were to have over the earth. Eventually, I'm assuming that if they did a good job in the Garden of Eden, that the whole earth would be given to them as to be kings and stewards of everything. But before that could happen, the serpent came and deceived the woman into violating God's command of not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then she gave some of that fruit to Adam, and he ate. He ate knowing what he was doing, but he ate anyway. God shows up in the garden in the cool of the day. And this is what I'm thinking, and I could be wrong on this. I could be totally out to lunch. But before the incident in the Garden of Eden, I believe Satan had already fallen. Satan had already been puffed up with pride and wanted to have the worship of all the angels and all of creation. And Satan is always wanting to copy what God's doing. So if God has people made in his image on the earth, and that these people are his servants and to have dominion over the earth, Satan is going to do the same thing. He wants to have people that he will work through who will, be in his image, who will have dominion over the earth. Whether Satan wanted to use Eve to do that, or whether he just wanted to destroy the whole plan of God of having people made in his image, we don't really know. But what we know is that Satan was there and he wanted to basically destroy Adam and Eve, because he knew that from what God had said, that the day that you eat that fruit, you will surely die. So with Adam and Eve out of the way, Satan could claim the earth then as his domain, because Adam and Eve had handed it off to him. So that's the reason why Satan is the prince of this world right now, is because we, through Adam, have given our okay for him to operate here on earth. So Satan is not going to operate underneath us. He's going to operate over us. And I'm sure that one of the things that he was thinking of is either I'm going to use these people to my advantage, or God's going to destroy his highest creation, people who are made in his image. And so he tempts Eve to violate God's command. God shows up and says, hey, where are you, Adam and Eve? Where are you? And a lot of good sermons preached on that, by the way. Adam, where are you? God shows up and says, where are you? And Adam and Eve, they realized what they had done, and immediately they sewed for themselves some fig leaves to cover their nakedness, okay? And they said, well, we were naked and we were afraid, we were ashamed. And God says, well, have you eaten from that tree I told you not to? And Adam says, well, the woman you gave me, she tempted me and I ate it. She gave it to me and I ate it. And the woman said, well, that serpent you put in the garden, he tempted me and I was deceived and I ate it. God looks at the fig leaves that these people have clothed themselves with. And by the way, it just says they are like a belt, or it's the word for belt or apron. So they just made these little flimsy garments that only, partially covered them. They didn't even totally cover them at all. And God then pronounces judgment. But he didn't kill Adam and Eve. Now, a lot of people will think, well, yeah, but they died spiritually. They were removed from a relationship with him. And yes, that's true. However, God continued to have a relationship with Adam and Eve, and he didn't kill them that day. They did survive. And why is that? The serpent may have thought that they were going to die the day that they ate the fruit. But God had another plan, and it was so out of the box that even Satan probably couldn't comprehend what this plan was. And that is, he was going to rescue mankind, but he was going to do it through a sacrifice. He was going to do it through a sacrifice. And the sacrifice would be a substitute. Okay, so on that day in the Garden of Eden, there was death that entered in. Okay, death entered the world, and death came on some animals that day because God sewed some skins and covered the people, covered Adam and Eve, gave them clothes to wear. He didn't give them, some nice cotton or linen clothes. He gave them skins from an animal. And the only way you can wear skins from an animal is to first kill the animal. When we see Abel, later on, when Cain and Abel have been born, Abel offers a lamb, and his sacrifice is accepted, and Cain's sacrifice of the fruit of the ground is not accepted. It's because the principle of a substitutionary sacrifice was introduced in the Garden of Eden. This was something that Satan couldn't have thought of ahead of time, that rather than killing Adam and Eve outright that day, He had a substitute die in the place of Adam and Eve. We see this again with Abraham and Isaac. Abraham is getting ready to offer up his son Isaac on the altar. He's raising the knife. He's about ready to kill him. When an angel says, don't do that, there's a ram caught by his horns in the thicket. God will provide for himself the lamb, okay? So that ram was used then as a substitute for Isaac. So in this case, the guilty were rescued. The guilty, they weren't righteous. Adam and Eve were totally guilty, but they were rescued through the sacrifice of a substitute. We also read that God pronounced, basically it's the first prophecy in the Bible, and this is in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. So God is going to give a prophecy of how the judgment for this violation is going to take place. And God is going to postpone the judgment for that moment. Okay, the judgment was taken up by the substitute. The temporary fix for the violation was this substitute, this sacrifice that provided the covering. And there was going to be a severe judgment for what had happened. So the first thing is that God curses the serpent, okay? And what he says is that he's going to crawl in the dust and he's going to go on his belly all the days of his life, and that God is going to put enmity or a war between the serpent and the woman, okay? So there's going to be this little war that's going on all the time between the serpent and the woman. The second thing is there's going to be a conflict between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. The seed of the serpent is the Antichrist, okay? The serpent is the dragon or Satan. And the seed of the woman is Christ, okay? And then what God says is this: he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. Okay, we know that at the cross, Jesus bruised the head of the serpent, okay, and that the serpent merely bruised the heel of Christ. Okay, this bruise wound that Jesus gave the serpent at the cross merely bruised his head, and it's not going to be until the final judgment at the end of the 1,000-year reign of Christ that the serpent is finally cast into the lake of fire. The total victory will be at the end of the millennium when Christ gets rid of him permanently. So there's this enmity, there's this crisis brewing between the serpent and the woman. And we see that sort of spelled out in Revelation chapter 12, where the serpent and the woman, he's wanting to pursue the woman, okay, so that he can destroy her. The woman in this case, in Revelation 12, is Israel, is personified as the woman. But really, Satan was going to try to corrupt or destroy the seed of any and every woman, okay? Which is one of the reasons for the incursion prior to the flood, when the fallen angels came and mated with human women. This was his attempt to corrupt the seed of the woman and make the seed of the woman be his seed, the serpent seed. Okay, the serpent seed is actually a hybrid being. It's the seventh king, okay, the rider on the white horse who only remains a little while. He's going to be killed. And then Apollyon, who will be released out of the pit where the watchers have been kept for thousands of years after the flood. They were consigned to the pit until the time of the end, until the time of judgment. And then Apollyon will indwell a resurrected Antichrist. And this hybrid being between a resurrected person and Apollyon is the seed of the serpent. Okay? And eventually, the seed of the serpent is going to have the final battle with the seed of the woman, who is Christ. And that will take place at Armageddon, when Christ appears to destroy this being. So you can see that judgment was postponed at the time of the Garden of Eden. Okay. And because God still had a plan for people to rule the earth. And his plan was, when the first Adam failed, the second Adam, the last Adam, who is Christ, would succeed. So when we read about Jesus being tempted, he wasn't tempted in a beautiful garden with only one prohibition. In the Gospels, we read that Jesus was tempted in the worst possible place. It was in a wilderness where there wasn't anything. And he was tempted while he was fasting. And Adam and Eve weren't fasting when they were tempted, and there was only one violation: don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. When Jesus was tempted, he was tempted with every temptation known to man, under the worst possible circumstances. And Jesus had to succeed in his version of the not Garden of Eden experience, his own version of the serpent coming to him and tempting him. But Jesus prevailed. Jesus prevailed over that. And then it says that the angels came and ministered to him at the end. Because he was able to withstand the temptation that he had, he became a perfect man who was tempted in every way that we are, yet without sin. And he is a sympathetic high priest who can sympathize with us because he's been tempted just as we are. And the book of Hebrews talks about this. So Jesus would follow this same path, okay, of temptation, only for him it would be worse, far, far worse than anything Adam and Eve experienced in their temptation in the garden. The goal is to bring everybody back into paradise, okay, back into this enclosed, beautiful garden, which will be known as the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation. That's the goal, to bring us back into that place. Only when we go to live in the New Jerusalem, we take after the last Adam, the second Adam, who is a glorified man. So we will be glorified too. We're going to have a body like his body. It's going to be a glorified body. One of the other things that happened in the garden, beside God cursing the serpent and the seed of the serpent and explaining salvation was going to be via a substitute, the other thing he did was he cursed the ground, okay? That it would just bear thorns and thistles, and that man would have to earn his bread or get his food, sweat of his brow. There's coming a day when that curse is going to be lifted. And Romans 8 talks about that, and it's in connection with the glorification of believers. This is what Paul says in Romans 8, starting with verse 18. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of him who subjected it in hope. Okay, so the ground was, and creation itself was subjected to futility. But there's a reason for that. Because the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the glorious liberty of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in travail together until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. And the redemption of our bodies is the glorification that he talks about in Romans 8, verse 30. So the plan is for all creation eventually to have that same glorious liberty that the children of God will have when they enter into their full redemption, the glorification of their bodies. So all of this is part of the judgment pattern. There is a violation God shows up. God either rescues the righteous, and in this case, in the case of the garden, God provided a substitute. Adam and Eve were not destroyed then. He provided the substitute sacrifice, and those skins were placed on Adam and on Eve, basically as their coverings, and this became then its own template or pattern for how God would deal with sin. It would be through the substitutionary sacrifice of his son, the seed of the woman. After God rescues the righteous, and in this case through the substitutionary atonement, then the judgment of God comes into play. And in Eden, it didn't happen. It's going to happen at the end when the serpent will be cast into the lake of fire at the end of the 1,000-year millennium, after the curse has been lifted, okay, after believers have been glorified. The seed of the serpent, who is the Antichrist, he's going to be cast into the lake of fire at Armageddon, okay, at the end of this 7-year time frame, at the end of 42 weeks of the reign of the beast. And so the judgment of God is going to be meted out in at different times, okay, and where it's finally completed at the end of the millennium. But the judgment of God also fell on Christ, okay? Christ bore the judgment and wrath of God that we deserved back here. He bore it for us. He was put to death so that he could be our sinless sacrifice. And because it was a sinless atonement that was given to us by the perfect Lamb, the perfect Son of God, he is able to, through that one sacrifice, perfect everyone. There is no more need for continual sacrifices over and over again. That one sacrifice was enough to forgive the sins of everyone. Okay, anyone who comes to Christ will have their sins forgiven. Faith is really important. You have to believe that Jesus died for you, and then you become like Christ. You are part of that new creation in Christ, that new humanity that we follow after the last Adam. We've been moved from the curse that fell on the first Adam and moved into the glory that it is a part of the life of Christ, the second Adam, the last Adam. Okay, there won't be any more after him. He's the very last one. This is the judgment pattern for the violation that we see right away in Genesis chapter 3. So the main judgments that were postponed was the judgment of the harlot, okay, Mystery Babylon, at the time of the Tower of Babel, and the judgment that was going to fall on the serpent, the seed of the serpent, the ground, okay, and the judgment that was to fall on man, but God rescued man. So this is all a postponed judgment. The final judgment of all of this will be at the end of the millennium. Let me know what you think, and we'll see you on another video. Till then, have a blessed day.